Hello everyone, and welcome to this 6G World webinar, exploring 6G IoT sustainability. Is IoT able to save or destroy the planet? My name's Alex Lawrence. I'm the managing editor of 6G World, and I'll be your host today. A quick plug for 6G World, for those that don't know it. It's a relatively new forum for news, debates, research and ideas to help the telecoms industry, academia and government to navigate successfully from the early days of 5G today through to the end of the decade and the early days of 6G. Now, the coming decade is going to see some demands on telecoms that it's never had to face before. Pressures in competition, economics, business models, social responsibility, and also sustainability. So if we want to end up with something fit for purpose by the time that we come to market, we need some new approaches. Now, the telecoms industry is the first, so far as I know, to take a public stand on the Sustainable Development Goals and benchmark progress against them. This is a positive step, of course, but at the same time, we see technologies emerging that might well affect how networks function and what impact the telecoms industry has on the world. The furthest progressed of these is IoT, with connected devices really starting to spread and, as ever, astronomical forecasts for how connected devices may take off over the next decade, from cars and drones to industrial sensors, VR, and so on. It doesn't look like it can be a good thing for the planet. Meanwhile, AI, blockchain, and other emerging technologies tend to be hailed as solutions to almost anything. So how should we evaluate the positive and negative impacts of these emerging technologies on the planet? And what can the telecoms industry do to move the needle? Now, this webinar builds on a white paper sponsored by InterDigital that Transforma Research published this week, examining the impact of new and emerging technologies on sustainability. Now, we'll hear more from Jim Morrish about the research during the coming hour, but if you want to access a free copy, it's available on 6gworld.com under latest research. You'll also be able to find a whole series of short videos by Jim and his colleague Matt Hatton conducting interviews with key players in sustainability, with fresh ones posted each day this week. Now, we won't just be talking about the white paper itself. Now, with me on this webinar are Stephen Moore, the Head of Climate Action at the GSMA, and Dale Seed, InterDigital's IoT Research and Innovation Principal Engineer and a key player at 1M2M. They'll be able to share insights from their own work and their priorities, both as a reality check on the research and also to help explore some of the most important topics in more detail. So over the coming hour, I'll ask my guests to introduce themselves and get Jim to give an overview of his research. And then we'll build from there in a conversation touching on some key topics and expanding upon them with the perspectives from Stephen and Dale. But the webinar is constructed essentially as a conversation. So we'd love to have your input. And please share your thoughts as we go. You'll find a Q&A button under the video feed, so feel free to use it. I'll do my best to weave your questions into the discussion. And then we'll also have some time for Q&A towards the end as well. If we don't get a chance to answer your questions, then I'll aim to follow up with you in the coming days. I'm sure everyone will be taking some careful notes throughout the webinar, but in case you miss a bit, we will be making a recording available on the 6G World website in 48 hours time or so, so on Friday. So please feel free to pop back and review it then. Right, now with that, Jim, can I ask you to give a brief taster of your research and the thought processes behind how you put it together?
Absolutely, yes, you can, Alex. Thank you very much for the introduction and for hosting and facilitating this. So on to the research. Well, firstly, starting off with the scope. The scope of the research, I think you've already described much of this, but it's focused on IoT and other emerging technologies. So at that point, we're thinking about things like artificial intelligence and distributed ledger or blockchain, data sharing, edge, human-machine interface. There's a whole range of new technologies which are coming over the horizon and are going to increasingly impact our lives and enterprise processes and enterprise propositions over the coming decade. It really is a period of very rapid change. So rightly, the thing to do is to say, well, what's the impact of this lot going to be? And that's really what we set out to do. So we started off with Transforma Insights existing forecasts of IoT devices and applications and the deployment and adoption of those things worldwide, and also forecasts for artificial intelligence and distributed ledger and robotic process automation, etc., etc. So we started off with those baseline forecasts and then said, well, what's the impact of these things? What's the impact of, for instance, a connected e-vehicle, or the impact of an element of a smart grid, etc. And we multiplied all this all together, added it up, and basically came to a view of the impact of these new technologies. So the idea was to compare the world with these technologies with the world without these technologies. So it was about the net impact. And the overall conclusion, top level conclusion, is that new technologies, as I've outlined up to now, so new technologies will save about 1.8 petawatt hours of electricity. And obviously there's a balancing, because these new technologies use electricity, but they also save electricity, and they save more than they use, to the tune of about 1.8 petawatt hours per year in 2030. They also save fuel to the extent of about 3.5 petawatt hours worth of fuel in 2030, and also about 230 billion cubic meters of water, and that's driven a lot by agricultural applications and crop monitoring and for instance, drone application of chemicals to specific plants in just the right quantities, rather than treating a whole field and all of the soil and missing much of the plant, just getting it just right with a drone, much more efficient. There's a whole range of applications like that. Most impactful applications overall, a range of smart grid applications, and that's including things like generation, smart metering, etc., and then more sophisticated concepts like virtual power plants and load balancing, and all of those capabilities that are needed to enable the grid to use renewable energy efficiency. Because the reality is that in the past, generation was dimensioned to match what consumption was at various times of day, and increasingly in the future, as we adopt renewables, what we're going to have to do is to manage the grid and manage consumption to match the supply, which is a complete change in the way that grids have worked. Beyond that, HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, that's a particularly impactful application. Road fleet management, particularly impactful in terms of fuel. In terms of the overall approach, though, it came clear to us that there are four main phases for a technology-based solution. You've got manufacturing, distribution, operation, and then end of life. And all of these phases tend to be a cost apart from the operation phase. And that operation phase is kind of where the magic happens. So if you think about the manufacturing phase, if you think about a television, to make that an IoT or a connected television, you need a bit more hardware in it. You're going to be shipping around something that's a bit heavier than the hardware without that communications device. In use, it's going to be connecting to data centers and cloud sources, etc. And then when you get rid of it, you've got a bit more e-waste. And this is illustrative of one of the interesting conclusions, actually, one of the first interesting conclusions, is consumer versus enterprise. Because many devices in IoT that become connected and are intended for consumer markets, the IoT functionality in them is actually meant to make it a better proposition, a higher value proposition, more capable, more functional. And that's the aim of the IoT enablement. And it quite often, consumer type devices are a cost at each stage: manufacturing, distribution, operation, end of life. On the flip side, things like enterprise applications, something like a fleet management solution or a stock monitoring solution, those things are there. They're developed and deployed in order to make operations more efficient. And that means that there's a benefit in that operation phase, which tends to quite significantly outweigh the costs in the other phases. So you've got really quite different dynamic there between consumer applications intended to be more value add and enterprise applications generally intended to make operations more efficient. There are exceptions to that rule. So for instance, connected heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, those just save energy whoever uses them, whether it's consumer or enterprise. And the next thing that was particularly interesting was the degree to which fuel is saved. So that's hydrocarbon fuel that we're talking about there. And one of the things we realized is that just swapping hydrocarbon fuel consumption for electricity consumption. So if you can invest in an electronic solution which saves some fuel, and even if the cost of the electricity in terms of energy is the same as the saving of fuel, well, then that's a good thing, because what you've done is you've pulled fuel consumption away from being a hydrocarbon to being something which is electricity. And electricity is much easier to source from renewable sources. So just pulling power consumption from fuel hydrocarbon to electricity is beneficial because of the potential next step. The other thing that was quite surprising, I think just one last point to pull out at this summary level. The other thing that's quite surprising is the scale of the CO2 savings from IoT. So overall, in 2030, the savings of CO2 from IoT solutions are going to be about 26 times the costs of those IoT solutions in terms of CO2 emissions. So that's really quite a significant return in terms of the impact of IoT as a technology. I'll come on to introduce some comments on the other technologies later in the conversation, perhaps, but start off leave the focus there on IoT at the beginning.
Great, thanks, Jim. Now, as you say, there's lots to come back to there, but I'd like to turn to our other two guests at this point, Stephen Moore and Dale Seed. Stephen, would you mind giving a quick introduction to who you are and what brings you here today?
Thanks very much, Alex. It's good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me to join today and to discuss this. I think it's a really important topic. So I'm responsible for the Climate Action Programme at the GSMA. So that's the International Industry Association for all mobile operators globally. And this climate programme began back in 2019 in February, when the board of the GSMA, which is made up of the largest mobile operators globally, made a commitment, which was to be net zero as an industry by 2050 at the latest. So fast forward 2 years, and we have just basically done an analysis of how we're doing against that target, which we just published quite timely for this, actually, because we just released this yesterday. And in general, pretty good news. Would you like me to go into this at the moment, Alex, or should I come back to the findings in a bit?
Yeah, let's hear about it just quickly. That sounds interesting.
Okay, so I'll just give you the headlines, which is we have around a third of the industry by revenue now is supportive and has a net zero by 2050 target, or sooner than 2050, actually, because quite a few of the mobile operators are really leading on this. And then the other big headline stat is 2/3 of the industry by revenue have a target to cut emissions rapidly over the next 10 years. So we've got a third have sort of longer term, and 2/3 actually, and there is an overlap between the two, 2/3 have a more immediate carbon reduction target to cut by 2030, which is potentially even more important, really, because we need to, as you know, we need to take action very rapidly on this issue.
That's brilliant. And obviously, as we talk about the need to cut emissions, I would love to follow up on that. But Dale, can you tell us about yourself? And also, I think you have news to share as well.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, it's a pleasure being here today, and great to talk about sustainability as well as IoT. So I think my role in this conversation is more from the technologist perspective. So I work for InterDigital. I've been working on IoT for the past 10 years or so, working on technology like protocols, services, and how those technologies can enable devices, applications, networks, and services to all come together, as well as the user to interact with one another and ensure that everything works more seamlessly together. So as far as the technology is concerned, we view IoT as very important. we also view sustainability as very important. So we've been looking at how do we marry those two together and complement each other. So we've been working on things like IoT platforms over the past 10 years. We've been working on standards, pushing out the ideas into standards to enable those ideas to become reality and enable interoperability between solutions, which we feel pretty strongly is a good point for sustainability. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Most recently, as part of the standards activity that I'm involved in, we formed a sustainability committee within the 1M2M standard. So like-minded individuals and companies are starting to come together within the 1M2M standards body to talk and have a closer look at sustainability as a topic. So let me just give you a couple examples of what we're trying to do there. If we take a look at some of the functionality within the standard, things like services to enable devices to sleep more intelligently or longer, which can help maximize their battery life, or functionality to manage how message communication flows through a network to and from devices and applications and users. Much in the same way that if you're looking at how do you manage traffic on a highway, you could think of the same thing within a network with devices. If we can aggregate traffic or create smaller messages, doing things like that within the standards body itself is something that we're keying in on, as well as functionality like digital twins. If I know it's a little bit more of a techie topic, but if we're able to take a device in the real world and create a representation of that device more in the virtual world, more in the network, we can allow these devices to sleep and turn off, but at the same time allow users to interact with the device using a virtual representation of that device. So that's a very technical type of aspect that can really help with the overall system. So these are some examples of what we're doing within the standards bodies, within the technology domain of IoT, to try to improve sustainability and reduce energy consumption, as well as make the overall systems become more efficient.
Okay, thanks, Dale. I appreciate that. Now I know maybe this is something that you and Stephen can comment on. I think publicly there is a certain degree of cynicism about organizations greenwashing for PR purposes, and not necessarily making decisions that are going to be materially significant in terms of their operations or how things affect the bottom line. Now, it sounds as though both from the GSMA and the 1M2M standpoint, that's not the case. But I would be interested to understand your perspectives on how that vision of greenwashing and that concern around it is affecting your work, and to what extent you feel that it is being driven by that public relations element.
Yeah, sure. I guess I can go first here. Is so to answer your question, Alex, I'm not sure to what extent or scale greenwashing is happening. What I do know is most recently there looks to be an increase in the amount of momentum and resources that are being directed towards sustainability, which I think is great to see. I can only hope that this tick up in interest level is sustainable in itself, such that people continue their interest and it keeps pace with what's going on today. I think I'd have to think a good percentage of these efforts are sincere in nature, and organizations and individuals are coming at it with good intentions. Of course, there could always be some of that jumping on the bandwagon per se, and folks using it as a PR kind of platform. But from my perspective, I operate more in the technical circles and domain, and I think from my viewpoint, the level of sincerity and responsibleness, I think it's been quite good from what I've seen so far. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, that's very reasonable. And I mean, Stephen, you're sort of operating, working with people at very much the executive level with regard to these endeavours. So, how much of this do you think, for your stakeholders is driven by sort of genuine ethical or pragmatic desires to improve the planet and their customers' lives.
I think what I'd say is we've come a really long way compared to when I started working in this field, which was 15 years ago, and that was when there was an increasing interest in issues around climate and sustainability, and then we had the big financial crisis, and then things kind of went on the back foot, and then we've seen it kind of raise up the agenda again since then to the pinnacle of where it is now, actually, on climate, which is above where it was before. I'd say particularly from the climate side, although I think more broadly in sustainability, things have become more rigorous. It's more difficult to greenwash now because there are better existing methodologies. We understand better what we need to do. We understand better the time frame over which we need to do it. We understand the cuts that need to happen. That these have been big learnings actually over the last 10 to 15 years. Huge amounts of investment and research, etc., has gone into this. And I'd say that particularly corporate climate action has come on leaps and bounds over that time. And I think about the way that we operate as the GSMA, engaging our members, and we're very clear about the types of methodologies and standards that are best practice, because we can see many of our members have adopted them already. They've helped inform us. We've got expert external opinion as well from NGOs, etc. And we work to help more of our members align their sustainability and climate efforts so that they're in line with these methodologies that have got rigorous standards behind them. So I think it's much more difficult now to do this. I think in particularly thinking about climate, and also in the I'll speak for the mobile sector. I think there are other areas where it's, because this is a very complex issue, what does it mean to be sustainable, and it's very different in different industries. And I'd say perhaps in some other industries it's easier to fudge, but I'd say what you need to do in the ICT telco sector is a little bit more straightforward.
Great, thanks. Now we've had a question in from Martin Rowe, which I think is sort of quite striking. I think in the telecoms industry, we're unusual in being able to talk about not just the environmental impacts that we're able to conduct ourselves, but in terms of being a platform for other industries to reduce their emissions or improve their sustainability. And a few years ago, I think a lot of arguments around telecom sustainability were based on helping other industries to be green, rather than, let's say, putting our own house in order when we were aware there may be increases in infrastructure and energy usage and so on to be taken into account. So the question from Martin is, to what extent is the growth in sort of transport and process of data associated with IoT devices able to be offset by the savings in other industries? And Jim, maybe you can comment on this, given your studies.
Yes, I can, definitely. So the first thing to say is that we considered that. When we looked at all of these new technologies, we looked at deploying them, the power consumption locally. We looked at the network communications power consumption and took into account how these things were connected. So the difference between mobile generations and also fixed line communications and satellite communications. We took that into account. And we also looked at the cloud power consumptions, the data center power consumption, and the cost of those servers, running those servers, cooling those servers, and also manufacturing and disposing those servers. So we looked at the whole thing. So we did do that. And even doing all that, there is a still, I mean, very clear benefits. I mean, that's the top line result, the factor of 26 that I gave earlier. That is the top line result, including that level of power consumption. Now, what you're getting at though, is that some things are quite intensive in terms of their power consumption. And if you look at some of the other emerging technologies, and then you go right to the extreme in terms of the application. So you look at something that's AI based, for instance, which is particularly processing intensive. And then you look at an application of AI which is designed to, I don't know, enhance security in a network. There's not a lot of, I mean, that's something that I'm talking security in a corporate network, corporate IT network. That's something that has to be done. I mean, you have to have security, and really you have to have AI in your security engines and in a corporate IT system. But the expected results that you're going to get from having those things there is not an increase in efficiency. This is effectively an investment to de-risk the operation and in some cases ensure compliance. So it's those applications that are particularly processing intensive but have little expected real world impact, although you couldn't run the world without them. Those are the ones where that you tend to have the net negative electricity power consumption, and even for a good number of those, when you look at the fuel savings, so the hydrocarbon fuel savings, what you figure out is that by the time you take into account the hydrocarbon fuel cost saves and you offset that against the electricity consumption, and then you consider that you can get the electricity from renewable sources, then many of these things begin to make sense as well. So there really are very few applications which are kind of net negative on a completely holistic level. And I know that there are specific initiatives ongoing. I'm sure that Stephen will outline some of them. Some specific initiatives ongoing to make communications networks more efficient, to better enable these overall efficient operations of solutions.
Great, thanks, Sue. That's a very good point. And Dale, to kind of some of the things that you were talking about earlier, I wonder if you could maybe pick up on this a little and talk about some of the impacts that you're seeing in terms of 1M2Ms as a standards body being able to reduce that energy usage, reduce that impact from the IoT environment.
Yeah. From a technology perspective, you do get some critics out there saying, well, what is the position of a standards body as it comes to sustainability, and what's the alignment or fit there? And I'm actually of the opinion that standards organizations play a very important role and have a lot to contribute to the sustainability topic. It's true that you'll hear arguments that standards organizations define the technologies, they don't actually deploy the technologies. And when it comes to deploying, that's where things really matter. But I think on the flip side of that, if you look at a standard and if it's defined in an inherently inefficient manner, if it's has chatty protocols, or it has large or frequent message exchanges, or if the services or algorithms that are defining are not optimized in energy efficient manners, then you're going to have a real tough time deploying a sustainable, efficient, responsible solution out there, no matter which company's doing it, right? So I think it needs to start with good, sound technology up front in the definition cycle, and that'll trickle down into the actual commercial deployment of it. So that's why my company and myself believe in getting involved early in that process, and then having it trickle down into the use of the technology in the field and the responsible use of the technology. So I mentioned a few examples earlier about what we're doing in the 1M2M standard around some of this, the different forms of technology. The 1M2M standard, just to provide a little bit more detail there, is where its value proposition is it's defining and standardizing what we call the IoT service layer in the industry. So we're not focusing in on radio technology. We're focusing in on higher level services that allow devices to be managed, secured, and interoperate with one another more in the layer that exists between the applications and the traditional protocol stack. So in a large part, a lot of that technology today is proprietary, and where we see the opportunity in the industry is for a one M2M standard to come in and harmonize the definition of that proprietary technology and those services, such that we can have more interoperable IoT deployments. We can have longer lived deployments, and if a consumer or an enterprise wants to then swap out technology, they don't have to throw away their whole deployment. Maybe they can swap out a piece, which is much more economical, much more efficient, and less e-waste, to be honest. So that we're coming at it from a standards perspective and looking at the benefits there as well. So within 1M2M and within our sustainability working group, we are looking at ways in which we can kind of get the word out more about 1M2M and the service layer and the IoT offering that we have and how that plays with the other IoT technology out there. But in addition to that, we're also looking to collect feedback and input from folks on what are some new requirements, what are some additional challenges. I think Jim was mentioning things like AI, and that we definitely want to take a look at that and how it can be used responsibly, and how we can use things like reuse and whether it's training data, labeling data. There's opportunities there for reuse as well, right? So we want to look at that as well.
Great, thanks, Dale. And you've touched upon something that I think our audience is asking about as well, which is to do with the impact of things like AI as potentially an all-pervasive and quite energy-intensive kind of new technology. And there's also a question in there about blockchain as well. And I know, Jim, you've been looking at those. So perhaps this is a good time for you to talk a little bit about these technologies.
Absolutely. So I touched on AI a little earlier. I mean, generally that does cost in. I mean, it varies by application, but broadly it does cost in, not enormously. But again, there becomes a significant benefit when you consider the hydrocarbon impact and then pulling that across onto the electricity side of the equation, and then potentially making it renewable. So that kind of covers AI. Blockchain, however, is something different. The energy consumed to power blockchain is beyond what you would possibly guess until you start analyzing the numbers. It's crazy. A huge amount of energy. So I think that a blockchain transaction, I think it's about 470 kilos of CO2 are generated for a single blockchain transaction. You can drive from Los Angeles to New York for that, and in a reasonably sized car. So the power consumption is huge. But then this is a very innovative technology, and it was specifically created to be very hard to crack. It's very hard to process, to find the next block to add to the chain, and that's the point of it, and that's why people have paid in blockchain bits, Bitcoin. So very intensive in terms of power consumption, and no, it is hard to see how that specific application pays off. In fact, in our analysis, what we did is we called out that one separately, and we parked it, and we said, okay, this is the size of the blockchain impact. We'll leave that out of the rest of the analysis. It is in fact outweighed by the rest of the analysis. So in terms of all technologies, the impact of blockchain is outweighed, but it is a huge number in there. One thing that is worth noting, though, is splitting the difference between blockchain and distributed ledger. Now, distributed ledger is a technology family of which blockchain is a decentralized, permissionless version, and there's a matrix there with 4 elements: the centralized, decentralized, permissioned, permissionless, and blockchain is decentralized and permissionless. And the term blockchain has become applied to the entire family. And actually, it's the other parts of the family that are more interesting than blockchain itself. So you just need to straighten out those definitions a little bit. And if you look at the distributed ledger non-blockchain applications, there are actually some quite impactful things in there, particularly when you want to start tracking, accurately tracking supply chains. And in fact, there's an example in the paper that's been published, which is Rice Exchange. And what they're doing is they're using blockchain to track rice that goes through exchanges right back to the suppliers, to understand how it was grown, so that they know it was grown in a sustainable way. They know it meets a certain quality. And beyond that, they know that the employers the employers who were supplying, who were growing this grain, treated their staff in a reasonable way, and it was, there were no human rights abuses, etc. So what you're doing there is you're using blockchain to verify things right through a supply chain. You can apply the same principles to carbon footprints at different elements of a supply chain. To farm to fork type tracing, potentially use it to support carbon taxes or the implementation and operation of carbon taxes. So distributed ledger technologies, different from blockchain, the currency, can actually be very impactful, and it's worth pulling those two things apart and treating them really quite differently, because they are very, very different.
Great, thanks. And Stephen, I don't know if from the sort of high-level strategic level, there have been any discussions around the use of distributed ledger or blockchain within networks, because I know that has been talked about at some points, and whether that's kind of contrary to what you're trying to accomplish within the climate action group.
I think I'll defer to Jim's answer on this. Definitely more comprehensive than anything I could give. I guess the thing I would say is it's good that it's being spotted, that it's a potential issue, because there are some misleading statistics that have been shared around things like, watching a film on Netflix being the same as a flight, and some other, if you send an email, it's worse than whatever. So I think it's good that this has actually been spotted and it is being presented in the correct light, because we understand that it is sometimes difficult to quantify this and to show, because everything is very, you don't see it, it's all happening in wires, it's not visible to you. So yeah, I just highlight the fact that it's good that this is we're seeing the environmental impact of this. How we go about addressing that, especially given some of the value of doing some of these things like Bitcoin mining. How do you go about addressing that when the rewards are so big? I think that's going to be a challenge.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Now, there's something which, from the network perspective, again, I'd be interested to get the panel's thoughts on. And again, the question is, if we're looking at moving towards electricity from renewables, either to replace non-renewable electricity or indeed to replace hydrocarbon fuel, then how realistic is it that we can actually make that change? And I mean, Stephen, I know you were saying that there are a number of operator groups out there who are being sort of very aggressive in terms of their shift towards carbon neutrality. So presumably they feel like they have at least part of the answer there.
Yes, absolutely. I think you can see which operators have 100% renewable electricity targets or have hit them already, which many of them have. And it's very much concentrated in developed markets. So you've got across Europe, actually several operators already using 100% renewable electricity. There's a very well developed and well established electricity market, certification schemes. It's easy to do power purchase agreements in general to access this. The same, even more such on power purchase agreements in the US, which are very widely used. But there are markets where it's much more challenging. So across Africa, across parts of Asia, sometimes there isn't a grid. So, you know, that's often a big problem. You know, we've done studies particularly looking at bad grid and off-grid sites, but they're ripe for on-site renewables. So they're the perfect territory, especially in places like Africa, you know, much closer to the equator, good amounts of sunlight for solar panels and battery. And the costs have just dropped through the floor over the last 10 years and continue to do so. I mean, it's where we're seeing that they're still losing out is where there's fossil fuel subsidies, which unfortunately do still exist in quite a few countries around the world. So are there enough renewables to go around? Yes, there is more than enough sun that falls on the earth. There's more than enough wind for us to capture, and the technologies have not reached their full potential yet. And already they are by and large cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives. It's a question more of distribution, deployment, and transfers of capital and investment. That's more the challenge at the moment.
Great, thanks. Now, there's something that, you know, the growth in IoT helps with in terms of increased efficiencies, and that's the idea of the sharing economy and new kinds of business models based on a better use of resources. So, Jim, when you were looking at, for example, questions around fuel reduction and so on, were you able to take into account any of these changes in business model or, you know, usage of, let's say, transport or other resources through the sharing economy?
So absolutely, where those things were associated with IoT and the other new technologies. So, for instance, share car is quite impactful, because if you know, for every share car that you have, you take more than one other car off the road because you're using that more intensively. So you're saving, manufacturing, distributing, maintaining, you know, a number of cars and concentrating on just using one. So there's significant efficiencies there. Where we did not extend to is the smartphone impact on the sharing economy. I know that Stephen's done some work in that area, so he may be able to add some comments. So that would be over and on top of what we've done. But so all of the connected public transport and the increased efficiency from operation of those transport networks and the access to shared assets, etc. That more efficient operations is all in there. And it's not all about smartphones. I mean, a smartphone is one half of, or one significant contributor to an overall evolving environment, and it takes that whole environment to evolve and the ecosystems to work together. So smartphones are part of it, but they lie beyond our analysis.
Great, thanks. Stephen, did you want to comment at all on what Jim was just saying?
Yeah, I mean, we did do some analysis of this. We produced a report called The Enablement Effect, which very much looked at similar areas that Jim has covered. We produced it in the end of 2019, and it was focused particularly on the mobile industry and did look at smartphone use as well as IoT. The savings were approximately evenly split across the two areas, smartphone use and IoT. Smartphone use was interesting because it enables, as Jim says, the sharing of resources, so that, you know, circular economy aspects. Airbnbs was scored surprisingly highly, because, you know, it means that you're able to use existing, effectively, housing infrastructure as hotels, so you don't have to build more hotels. And transport was high up there. Things like mobile banking, things like online shopping. So it's a lot of it is avoided trips. Is part of it, and we're doing more and more through our phones, and we're going to be linking them up to IoT devices in things like smart homes. We expect to see more of in the future, the whole smart energy system, which I think Jim's research covers off really well, and there's we did some research specifically in that area that we launched earlier this year on smart energy systems, and the potential for that is absolutely enormous. There'll be huge savings by making sure that we much more closely balance supply and demand, so that we don't need to over-generate renewable electricity. I mentioned before it is abundant and it's reliable, but it's intermittent. So, and those are slightly different things. So we know that it will happen, we know that it will generate energy, and we can fairly predict when it will happen, but we also don't know it's 100% of the time. So we just need to balance that across grids, which will be a combination of things like battery storage, other types of storage, but also managing consumer demand. And some of that can be done automatically, which is where there's huge potential of IoT devices and things like AI algorithms, etc.
Right, thanks, Stephen. We've had a question in which I think deserves to be asked. I know we're getting into the last quarter of the hour now, so we'll probably look at running this one and then maybe sort of having a wrap up. But the question is, are you seeing suppliers bringing sustainability in the business case to win new IoT business? Or are most business cases still based on cost savings and productivity gains if you're selling to enterprises? Now, Dale, I think this ties in with something I was hoping to ask you, and that is, to what extent you're seeing a push from enterprises to demand sustainability from 1M2M and the systems that you're providing. And is that an ethical thing, or is that a question of cost savings?
Yeah, I think one thing that we could touch upon here is, with the deployment of IoT and it now spanning out across the industry, it's creating this platform upon which devices, and more importantly, maybe the data that's associated with those devices, it's creating an ecosystem where this information and devices can be shared across multiple verticals, multiple entities, multiple stakeholders. And I think that in itself has a nice impact or potential impact from a sustainability perspective, that you don't necessarily have to go off and reinvent the wheel or deploy your own sensors or collect your own data. There's an ecosystem that's forming, and it's quite fragmented still, to be honest, right? But it is becoming more accessible and more connected, and hopefully over time that will continue. So when it comes to deployments and people going in and either requesting quotes or submitting quotes in, it's players that can actually bring solutions to market that can enable that type of ecosystem that I think are the ones that are starting to get a bit more traction, especially in certain deployments. Like if you look at the smart city domain as one example, smart city is a very complex type of deployment. It typically takes a lot of different players coming together, a lot of different technologies coming together within the domain of a city in order to make everything kind of work more efficiently together. So it's a natural fit for an IoT type of solution where we can bring in aspects of the physical world and tie them in and allow things to interoperate more effectively together. So I think there is some undertones and some progress being made in this area, but there's a lot of work to be done still. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I'll open that up to Jim and Stephen, just in case you've got some other perspectives on this idea of sustainability as a competitive advantage or a driver of competition.
I'd probably say that, in terms of our membership, the operators, they're all really keen on making their supply chains more sustainable. So they are including it in terms of criteria for their suppliers. And we're seeing that have quite a big impact, because they're large businesses and they have a lot of suppliers, and also a lot of they have a lot of suppliers in common. So, if you start to get quite a few of them all asking the same questions, then, and also some of them are just making it mandatory. So already they have things like, you know, ISO 14001, the environmental management system. It's pretty much mandatory if you're going to be a supplier to some of these big operators. And the minimum that's mandatory increases, they're increasing kind of year on year.
Right, thanks, Stephen. Now, I realise we're coming up to the top of the hour, so I'd just like to put a final question to each of you. We'll go around in turn. What I'd like to ask is what each of you sees maybe as the most important next steps that need to be taken, or the most important gap still that needs to be filled in terms of sustainability. And if our audience is interested in getting more involved, then what would your recommendations be? Jim, perhaps I can start off with you to take
Yes, absolutely. So I think much of the demand is there. Stephen was mentioning the demand into companies, and in terms of the procurement, there's a clear emerging consumer pressure as well. So I think the most important next step is transparency. And this is actually somewhere interesting where distributed ledger, but not blockchain, could be incredibly useful in terms of actually tracking exactly how CO2 is created through supply chains, making sure things are counted correctly, not counted twice, and making sure ensuring the integrity of those records. So I think transparency will add a lot, and adding statistics to companies and to goods, and labels on fashion goods saying that this was produced with X CO2 footprint or produced in a sustainable way. And I think it needs to be extended out potentially into consideration of human rights and the broader good corporate world context, rather than simply focusing on CO2 and energy consumption. But above all, I mean, overall, I think what we need is we need a big dialogue. We need to think how we want to live in the future, and people need to understand the changes that need to be made to make a difference. And also, we need to consider what mitigation strategies there are and what could be done to combat this. I mean, if you're at university now and you're contemplating your future life, probably the most important thing that you could do to impact your carbon footprint would not to have children. That might not be somewhere we want to go. So we need to have that kind of discussion.
Great, thanks. And Dale, perhaps I can ask you about next steps and potential audience involvement.
Sure. Yeah. Just to wrap it up from my perspective is, first and foremost, I believe the efforts like we're having today to have candid conversations about this topic are important. Taking an honest look at a very complex topic like sustainability is not always easy. And throwing technology at a complex problem is also sometimes not always the easy or right answer either. So I think as an industry and as a society, kind of taking a step back, as well as getting people involved and being careful and responsible on what we're doing here, I think is what's needed. The tough part is how to best do that, right? And that's what I think we need to all come together and figure out, because it's not just purely a sustainability conversation. There's a lot of, some of the things Jim was saying in his report, and as well as we were talking about here today, is there are some competing circumstances. There are some problems that we're trying to solve that will require a lot of energy, so it'll be more of a question of a balance and a responsible use of technology, maybe to help out and alleviate some of the challenges. But I think that this journey is just starting for us, so we'll have to continue to go down this path. And some of the efforts we're now seeing across different organizations, like the ones I'm participating in, as well as many others, I'm sure, I think are a step in the right direction. So if folks would like to join in and take part in some of these, I would like to just welcome people to reach out. And the door is open, and the organizations that I'm participating in, for example, the 1M2M Sustainability Subcommittee, looking at IoT, and its use, please join us, and it would be great to carry on some follow-on conversations about on the topic here. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Dale. And Stephen, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, what do we have to do? We have to do a huge amount in a very short space of time. So sometimes it's, you get very fired up. Sometimes it all seems a bit too much. But I think we've seen actually really great leadership from the corporate sector over the last 10 years. I think there were big hopes for what would be agreed amongst governments 10 years ago. We did have Paris in terms of climate change. That's we've had COP26 that's been delayed to this year. I think we really need to see governments take, and to pick up on Jim's point, we need to see governments take more initiative and recognise that this requires quite a fundamental transformation. But it's for the better. The world that we will live in, if we do these things, will be a better world. It shouldn't be a difficult sell if you're a politician. I think that there is just a bit of a lack of understanding, especially a lot of them don't have necessarily science backgrounds, and a lot of this is quite technological. But I think what we see maybe during the pandemic is a bit more of an openness and a willingness to accept science and bring scientists and technologists into the conversation. And I really hope that that will continue, because the type of world that we will change to, I think we'll look back and just think, God, how do we do things so inefficiently, so in such a dirty way, etc. Or really hope that we'll get to that position. I mean, in terms of how people can help take this forward, first of all, just looking inside your own organization and thinking, are we doing enough? Are we engaging with this topic enough? Do we have even anyone who really understands this, and can we upskill ourselves in this space? And then also just recognizing there'll be a lot of talk around what you should do as an individual. There are things you can do as an individual, but I think let's not place the entire responsibility on the individual. This requires systemic transformation. Even if we all didn't fly tomorrow, that's not going to solve climate change. So I think also just recognizing that and thinking at the ballot box at the same time.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And so with that, we're coming up to time. It only remains for me to thank Dale, Stephen and Jim, as well as you, the audience, for your great questions. Remember, if you want to see the webinar recording, it will be available at 60world.com 48 hours from now, so Friday, along with plenty more great material that expands on this topic. If you have questions, comments or suggestions, feel free to get in touch through the site. We always love to hear what you're doing. So thank you once again, and goodbye for now.